The men of the 258th Infantry Division had not slept in 2 days. They lay in shallow scrapes at the edge of a birch forest, wrapped in the same summer uniforms they had worn since crossing the Soviet border in June. The temperature was minus 18 degrees Celsius. The wind came from the northeast and moved without interruption across 300 kilometers of frozen steppe before reaching them. Their rifles did not fire. The lubricating oil in the bolt mechanisms had congealed overnight into a substance closer to wax than fluid. Soldiers scraped at it with bare fingers, pressing metal against skin, until sensation left the fingertips entirely. Several men did not notice when the skin on their fingertips turned white, then hardened. They were beyond the sensation of pain by that point. Pain requires blood flow. Blood flow requires warmth. The 258th had crossed the Nara River 11 days earlier, advancing against Soviet positions that should, according to the operational timetables issued in October, have already collapsed. They had not collapsed. The Soviet 33rd Army held a line east of the Nara and contested every kilometer with rifle fire, artillery and tank counterattacks that came at irregular intervals, often at night, often in temperatures the Germans had not been trained to fight in and had not been equipped to survive. Private Heinrich Harpe, serving as a medical officer attached to the 6th Infantry Regiment, recorded on November 12th that the wounded presented injuries he had not encountered in France, Poland or Yugoslavia. Frostbite progressed through tissue faster than battlefield wounds in temperate conditions. A man who sustained a minor wound and lay in the open for 90 minutes arrived at the aid station with necrotic extremities more threatening to his survival than the wound itself. Harpe wrote that he was performing more amputations than suturing. He did not write this with drama. He wrote it the way a man records facts he cannot alter. The horses were dying in greater numbers than the men. Army Group Center's logistics operated on a foundation of horse-drawn transport. The Wehrmacht's motorized reputation concealed a dependency on horse columns that stretched hundreds of kilometers back to railheads in Smolensk and Vyazma. In November 1941, those horses, primarily requisitioned Central European breeds not selected for cold weather endurance, were succumbing to the conditions at a rate that supply officers described in their field reports as catastrophic. Animals that had marched since June through mud, dust and freezing rain arrived at forward positions with hooves split from frozen ground contact, coats matted with ice, and body weights reduced to the point where they could no longer pull fully loaded ammunition wagons. Many simply stopped moving and did not start again. When a horse died on a frozen road, the column behind it halted. In November, that halt might last hours. In the darkness, at minus 20, hours were not inconveniences. They were medical events. The 258th Infantry Division's supply situation on November 14th reflected the state of the entire army. The divisional quartermaster's log recorded that winter clothing reserves allocated to the division had not arrived. The division had submitted its requisition in September. The response had noted the request. It had not fulfilled it. The felt overboots, the padded trousers, the sheepskin coats, the winter weight gloves, none of these had reached the men lying in birch scrape positions outside Istra. What existed in the supply chain existed somewhere behind Smolensk, aboard freight cars that had not moved in days because the narrow Soviet rail gauge required transshipment, and the transshipment points were operating at a fraction of their intended capacity due to partisan activity, locomotive failures in the cold, and administrative bottlenecks that no one in the high command had yet resolved. The men improvised. They stuffed newspaper into their boots. They wrapped their feet in burlap sacks stripped from ammunition crates. Officers had issued orders in late October that soldiers should acquire any local textile material available, meaning, in practice, that soldiers stripped curtains from abandoned Soviet farmhouses, cut blankets into foot wrappings, and pulled civilian coats from bodies. The results were visually inconsistent with a modern European army and thermally inadequate. They slowed the progression of frostbite without preventing it. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding the 43rd Corps to which the 258th belonged, had been writing privately since October with a clarity that his official dispatches could not contain. He had served in the First World War. He had seen exhausted armies before. What he was recording in November 1941 was different in character. not a temporary depletion recoverable through rest and resupply, but a systemic deterioration of an army's physical capacity to continue functioning as a military instrument. The men attacking Soviet positions outside Moscow were not the same men who had crossed the border in June. They were reduced versions of those men, carrying fewer rounds, operating fewer vehicles, driving fewer tanks, and surviving on rations cut to 60% of standard allocation. The 258th Infantry Division had crossed the Soviet border with approximately 15,000 men. By November 14th, it fielded fewer than 6,000 effective combatants. The remainder were dead, wounded, frostbitten to non-effective status, or hospitalized with illness. The division's artillery complement had been reduced by mechanical attrition. Vehicles that broke down on frozen roads and could not be repaired in the field without spare parts that existed at depots 800 kilometers to the west. 3 of the division's anti-tank guns had been dragged forward by hand when the horses assigned to them failed. The crews who dragged them were not in a condition to then service them with technical precision. To the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army was attempting to reach Tula. Tula sat 170 kilometers south of Moscow, at the junction of 2 rail lines that fed the Soviet capital. If Guderian's armor took Tula, Army Group Center could begin encircling Moscow from the south. This was the theory. The practice, in November 1941, was something else entirely. The 4th Panzer Division, which had entered Operation Barbarossa with over 200 tanks, reached the approaches to Tula with fewer than 50 operational vehicles. Of those 50, many operated with reduced range because the fuel lubricants specified in their maintenance manuals had been formulated for conditions above -15 degrees. Below that threshold, the lubricants thickened and engines required preheating before starting, a process that failed entirely when temperatures dropped to -25 or below. The optical sights on German tank main guns fogged in the extreme cold. Condensation formed on interior optics when hatch covers were opened, then froze, reducing visibility through the gun sight to near zero. The firing accuracy of German tank guns at range, which had been a tactical advantage throughout the summer and autumn, was severely degraded. Guderian personally inspected forward positions during the first week of November. He visited the 17th Panzer Division and the 3rd Motorized Division. He recorded what he found not in memoranda to Army Group Center, but in a letter to his wife that survived the war. He wrote that the men were unrecognizable from the soldiers of June. He wrote that the tanks were running on improvised solutions. He wrote, with a precision characteristic of the professional soldier, that he did not see how the army could continue the advance without winter equipment, reinforcement, and a restructuring of the supply chain. He did not send this assessment to Hitler. He sent a version of it to Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center. Von Bock was already receiving versions of the same assessment from every corps commander in his order of battle. The combined combat power of Army Group Center's formations on November 1st was approximately 40% of the combat power they had deployed on October 2nd, when Operation Typhoon began. In 30 days of renewed offensive operations, the Army Group had consumed 60% of the fighting strength it had possessed at the start of the operation. The encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk had captured over 600,000 prisoners in the Vyazma pocket alone, creating an expectation that Soviet resistance had been exhausted. What that expectation failed to account for was the Soviet capacity to generate replacement formations from internal reserves that German intelligence had not correctly assessed. The Fremde Heere Ost had calculated in September 1941 that the Soviet Union had no further formations available for sustained defensive operations. The calculation was wrong, but it was the calculation on which Operation Typhoon's planning had been based. By November, the evidence to the contrary was arriving at von Bock's headquarters daily. New Soviet formations identified in front of 9th Army. Fresh equipment, T-34s, BM-13 rocket artillery, and 76.2mm anti-tank guns, appearing in positions previously held by formations assessed as depleted. Von Bock forwarded the reports to Army High Command. He received in return operational directives that assumed conditions as they had existed in October. General Erich Höppner, commanding 4th Panzer Group, submitted a combat strength return on November 8th, documenting his group's tank strength at approximately 30% of establishment and requested authorization to halt temporarily and await resupply. No authorization was granted. The directive, received 2 days later, ordered continuation of the advance toward Moscow's western approaches. The infantry divisions supporting the panzer groups were in worse condition than the armour. A tank's interior retained some warmth from engine operation. The infantryman had no such protection. His standard Wehrmacht leather boots were not insulated. The leather became rigid in extreme cold, restricting circulation. The 87th Infantry Division, operating on the northern axis toward Klein, submitted casualty returns for the first 2 weeks of November, showing more non-combat incapacitation from cold injuries than combat casualties. 40% of all cases presenting at aid stations were cold-related, with a significant proportion requiring amputations that rendered the affected soldiers permanently non-deployable. Army Group Centre required approximately 30 supply trains per day to maintain operations. In the second week of November, it was receiving an average of 18. Ammunition deliveries were prioritised, meaning fuel, food, winter clothing and spare parts arrived in that order of deprioritisation. General Georg Thomas, head of the Wehrmacht's War Economy and Armament Office, had been raising supply warnings since July. His November assessments predicted a logistical breakdown within weeks. They were acknowledged. They did not alter the operational directives. October 1941 had been abnormal in ways that German planners had not anticipated. The autumn rains in Russia, the period known as the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, had arrived early and with exceptional intensity. The roads east of Smolensk, existing primarily as unpaved tracks across clay soil, dissolved under the weight of tracked vehicles, horse columns and motorized transport. The advance slowed to a near halt as vehicles sank axle deep and horses struggled for traction on surfaces with the consistency of wet concrete. Then the mud froze, the temperature dropped from just above 0 to -10, then to -15, then to -20 across approximately 2 weeks in late October and early November. Wheeled vehicles could move on frozen ground that had been impassable in mud. Supply columns that had been stuck began to move. This created a brief operational window when Army Group Centre's advance resumed with unexpected momentum. The 7th Panzer Division captured Klein on November 23rd, and the 2nd Panzer Division reached a point 32 kilometers from the Kremlin on December 1st. Reported upward to Hitler's headquarters, these advances reinforced the belief that a final push could reach Moscow before winter consolidated its grip. The belief was incorrect. The brief momentum was consuming the last operational reserves of formations that had nothing left to draw on. Standard Wehrmacht lubricating oils were formulated for operation down to approximately -15 degrees Celsius. At -20 and below, they lost their viscosity and ceased to function. Engine starts became uncertain events. Hydraulic systems in artillery pieces failed. The recoil mechanisms on anti-tank guns did not cycle correctly. Automatic weapons, the MG-34, required operator preheating of the receiver before firing to prevent the mechanism from freezing mid-sequence. The standard Wehrmacht issue, winter kit, at the point when November temperatures reached -20, had not arrived. It is documented in quartermaster records, divisional after-action reports and officer correspondence at every level of the command chain. The winter equipment existed. It had been produced, packaged and transported to depots. The failures were in distribution and prioritization. When choices were made between ammunition and winter clothing, ammunition was chosen. When choices were made between fuel and winter rations, fuel was chosen. Winter clothing was not chosen. Winter clothing orders had been placed late, produced at reduced scale, and allocated on a timeline that assumed the campaign's end, not its continuation. When the campaign continued, the clothing was not ready in the quantities required, and the distribution infrastructure to move it to the front was already overloaded. The result, visible in every November report from Army Group Centre, was an army fighting at -20 degrees in summer uniforms. Fedor von Bock arrived at his headquarters at Smolensk as one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced army group commanders. His war diary reveals a commander increasingly aware of the gap between what his forces were being asked to do and what they were physically capable of doing. Von Bock could note in his diary that the advance toward Moscow was beyond his army group's sustainable capacity. He could not simply halt. Halting required authorization from Hitler. Hitler would not authorize withdrawal or consolidation. His November 14th situation report noted that Army Group Centre had reached the condition of a spent force. Divisions were operating at 30 to 40% of their establishment strength. The supply deficit was acute. Soviet resistance was intensifying while fresh formations continued to appear on his front. The situation report was received at OKH. The fact that Army Group Center was still advancing, however slowly, was being read as evidence that the advance could continue. This was the most consequential misreading of the available evidence. The continued advance was not evidence of sustainable operational capacity. It was evidence that the soldiers were still attacking because they had been ordered to attack. An army advancing because its commander has not authorized it to stop will advance until the soldiers physically cannot continue, and then stop not in a controlled withdrawal, but in a disordered halt, wherever the energy runs out. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army had been committed to the southern axis with the objective of taking Tula and enveloping Moscow from the south. Tula had not fallen. The city was defended by the 50th Army under General Ivan Boldin and by the Tula Workers' Militia, a formation German intelligence had not included in its order of battle assessments because it had not existed as a military unit before October. The militia defended the city's perimeter through November with a tenacity that consumed Guderian's tank strength faster than he could replace it. On October 2nd, 2nd Panzer Army fielded approximately 600 operational tanks. By November 20th, the operational count was below 200. The losses were not primarily from combat. The vehicles were being lost to mechanical failure, fuel deprivation, and the cumulative damage of 4 months of operational use without adequate maintenance. Guderian drove to Army Group Center headquarters on November 13th and requested authorization to halt offensive operations, secure winter positions, and prepare for a defensive posture until spring. Von Bock denied the request. He had no authority to grant it. Hitler's directive for the capture of Moscow remained in effect. Guderian returned to his headquarters and continued the advance on Tula. He also began writing directly to OKH about the frostbite rates, the tank shortages, the absence of winter lubricants, and infantry divisions marching through temperatures that were killing men before combat could reach them. He did not receive the response that his reports warranted. The Soviet command's understanding of Army Group Center's condition in November 1941 was imperfect but improving. Stalin had installed General Georgy Zhukov as commander of the Western Front in early October, following the catastrophic encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. Zhukov's defensive organization was built on the assumption of an attacker who was overextended. He positioned his forces to defend key road junctions and approach routes, created a reserve with which to counterattack any German penetration, and accepted that he would trade space for time while reinforcements arrived. Those reinforcements were coming from a direction German intelligence had not predicted. In the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union had maintained approximately 40 divisions in the Far East, positioned against the possibility of a Japanese attack from Manchuria. The transfer of these forces west became possible when the intelligence agent Richard Sorge, operating in Tokyo, transmitted a conclusion that would alter the strategic balance. Japan would not attack the Soviet Union. The Japanese strategic decision had tilted toward the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Stalin acted on this. The transfer of Far Eastern divisions westward began in October and accelerated through November. The divisions that arrived in front of Army Group Center were not mythological formations of specially trained cold-weather troops. They were regular Red Army divisions acclimatized to cold through the simple mechanism of living in it for years, equipped with the standard Soviet winter uniform: felt boots, padded trousers, padded jackets, fur caps, and arriving with their full establishment strength, having not been engaged in 5 months of continuous fighting. The contrast with the German divisions they faced was one of condition. A Soviet soldier in a felt boot at -20 degrees is functional. A German soldier in a summer leather boot at -20 degrees is a casualty in progress. This is not a cultural or national characteristic, it is physics. 18 Soviet rifle divisions would eventually be transferred from the Far East and committed to the defense of Moscow. Prisoner interrogations in November produced consistent reports of German condition: no winter clothing, frozen weapons, reduced rations, exhausted soldiers who had been fighting since June. Zhukov used this data in planning what would come next. The Soviet industrial relocation program had moved entire factory complexes east of the Urals. Armament plants were disassembled, transported to Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and Novosibirsk, and returned to production within months. The T-34 production line, relocated from Kharkov to the Ural tank plant at Nizhny Tagil, resumed operation in November 1941. Army Group Center was advancing toward a city that was receiving reinforcement, rebuilding its industrial base and preparing a response. At the Wolfschanze in East Prussia, the picture of the Eastern Campaign in November 1941 was drawn from filtered information. Bad news moved upward through the German military hierarchy with institutional reluctance. Good news moved quickly. The result was a command picture that consistently lagged behind the frontline reality. Hitler, when presented with supply shortfalls and casualty figures, consistently interpreted them as failures of will rather than as structural limitations. This produced directives demanding greater effort from formations that had already exceeded their sustainable effort, and replacements of commanders who reported accurately and were perceived as defeatist. Several corps commanders began moderating the negative character of their reports, not to lie, but to present the same information in a framework that emphasized what had been achieved rather than what could not be sustained. The picture reaching OKH was systematically more optimistic than the frontline reality. Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, wrote on November 23rd that the Army was approaching the limits of its human and material endurance. He continued to endorse operational directives that demanded the Army exceed those limits. The gap between his private recognition of crisis and his professional compliance with Hitler's directives was the result of a command culture in which formal opposition led to dismissal and replacement, an outcome assessed as worse than compliance with a flawed directive. The second week of November brought temperatures to the Moscow region that had not been recorded in that area since 1812. German military meteorologists documented a temperature drop in the Moscow operational area between November 6th and November 12th, from -8 degrees to -24 degrees Celsius. By November 18th, temperatures in the Klin sector had reached -32 degrees. At the Guderian front south of Tula, temperatures of -35 were recorded at German divisional observation posts. The average winter minimum in the Moscow region falls between -10 and -15 degrees. The temperatures of November 1941 represented an extreme cold event, survivable by populations with appropriate equipment and shelter. They were not survivable by soldiers in summer uniform sleeping in unheated positions without fuel to warm their food. At -20 and below, peripheral vasoconstriction reduces circulation to hands and feet to the point where tissue damage begins within hours of unprotected exposure. The tissue freezes, ice crystals form in the cells. When rewarmed, cellular damage becomes apparent through blistering and necrotic progression. German medical officers were treating frostbite as a primary casualty category, in numbers the Wehrmacht's medical system had not been designed to accommodate. The evacuation system was saturated. The hospital facilities behind the front were overwhelmed. Cold also degrades cognition, decision-making capacity, reaction time, and manual dexterity, all measurably decline under extended extreme cold exposure. Soldiers making tactical decisions after hours at -25 degrees were not performing at the level their training had produced. German medical officers were also observing the first significant cases of combat exhaustion in Army Group Center formations, presenting as emotional dysregulation, inability to sleep despite exhaustion, and what officers described as a glazed or absent quality to the soldiers' eyes. The divisional effectiveness returns documented an army shrinking not through dramatic battlefield disaster, but through daily incremental loss. 20 men to frostbite on a given morning, 3 tanks broken down beyond field repair, a company at 40% strength, a battery operating with borrowed personnel. The aggregate was a slow collapse. By late November, Field Marshal von Bock was receiving situation reports that described an operational crisis without precedent in his military experience. The 9th Army under General Strauss reported its divisions north of Moscow incapable of sustained offensive action. Its frontage was too wide for its available strength. Gaps existed in the line, Soviet pressure was increasing. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army reported effective operational collapse south of Tula. The army was defending its current positions but could not attack. Its tank strength was a fraction of establishment. The frostbite rate had removed more men from effective strength in November than enemy action. Von Bock composed a message to OKH on November 25th, the most direct statement of Army Group Center's condition yet submitted to the High Command. He wrote that his army group had reached its culminating point, that the formations advancing on Moscow were physically incapable of capturing and holding the city, even if they reached its outskirts, that the supply system could not sustain offensive operations through December, and that a halt was required. OKH acknowledged the message. The operation continued. Von Bock wrote on November 28th that he had received no substantive response. He wrote on November 30th that the divisions were burning through their last reserves. He wrote on December 1st that the army group would shortly be unable to conduct offensive operations regardless of orders. He was correct. On the northern axis, Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Group had captured Klin on November 23rd and continued advancing towards Solnech-Nogorsk. The 7th Panzer Division, leading the advance, was operating with fewer than 90 tanks from its establishment of over 200. Its infantry regiment, the 6th, had been in continuous combat since June and had received no replacement drafts since October. The regiment's 3 battalions fielded, collectively, approximately 1,000 effective combatants, the normal strength of a single battalion. The 2nd Panzer Division on December 1st, 1941, was operating at approximately 25% of its June establishment strength. Soldiers from its forward elements reported being able to see the reflected glow of Moscow's lights on the cloud layer at night. The division's commanding officer noted that if a sustained Soviet counterattack struck his positions, he did not have the strength to hold them. He received no reinforcement. To the south, Guderian's last major offensive effort, a flanking movement east of Tula through Venev toward Kashira, was repulsed on November 27th by a Soviet armoured counterattack, including elements of the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps. The army was spent. The attack could not be resumed. Guderian submitted a formal request on November 26 to halt offensive operations, establish winter defensive positions, and redistribute winter clothing to sectors with the greatest need. Von Bock forwarded it to OKH with his endorsement. OKH declined. The advance was to continue. The advance did not continue in any meaningful sense. Guderian's formations made no further ground. They remained in the positions they held on November 27th, defending against Soviet counterattacks, with forces too depleted to resume the offensive and too exposed to hold for long. On the central axis, Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group had advanced to within 30 kilometers of Moscow by late November. Soviet defenders, reinforced by new formations and supported by artillery operating more effectively in the cold, contested every position with methods that German troops described in field reports as qualitatively different from Soviet defensive tactics in the summer. The difference was not mystical. It reflected 5 months of Soviet military adaptation. The Red Army of December 1941 was not the Red Army of June 1941. Its infantry, equipped for winter, could survive in positions that German infantry could not occupy without suffering incapacitating cold casualties. Its anti-tank gun crews, dug in and camouflaged, engaged German tanks at close range with weapons whose ammunition penetrated the armour of the Panzer III and Panzer IV at distances that the degraded German optical sights could not effectively engage. Army Group Center was advancing into a defence that was not weakening. By the first days of December 1941, Georgy Zhukov had assembled his counteroffensive forces with a secrecy and organisational discipline that German intelligence had not detected. Zhukov was not planning an annihilation operation. He did not have the strength for that. What he had was enough strength, concentrated on specific axes, to attack German formations at the end of their operational capacity and inflict the kind of local defeats that would produce a general withdrawal. The German flanks were the answer: Guderian's army to the south, Reinhardt's Panzer Group to the north, exposed, lightly held, and dependent on the continued advance of adjacent formations to prevent envelopment. Zhukov positioned 3 Soviet armies against the northern flank: the 1st Shock Army, the 20th Army, and the 10th Army to the south. These formations included several Far Eastern divisions, the 78th Rifle Division, the 32nd Rifle Division, and others, along with ski battalions, cavalry formations equipped for winter warfare, and armoured units whose T-34s had been configured with winter lubricants. The T-34's wide tracks provided advantages on snow-covered terrain that the narrower German tanks could not match, and it was present in numbers reflecting the Ural production lines now operating at capacity. The weather on December 5, 1941, was minus 27 degrees Celsius across the Moscow front. At 0300 hours, Soviet artillery opened along the northern sector from positions that German observation had not located. The 3rd Panzer Group's forward positions received fire of a concentration that exceeded anything German formations had experienced in November. Within the first hour, 2 German regiment command posts had been destroyed. Communications between forward battalions and divisional headquarters had been severed, and Soviet infantry was moving through the darkness in temperatures the defending German soldiers physically could not sustain in the open. The attack hit exhausted formations holding positions they had occupied in late November, with no further defensive preparation. There had been no time for defensive preparation. The soldiers had been attacking, or attempting to attack, until the day before the Soviet counteroffensive opened. The 7th Panzer Division, which had led the capture of Klin 3 weeks earlier, received the counteroffensive with approximately 70 operational tanks and infantry battalions at 50% strength. Its defensive positions had been dug into frozen ground that required pneumatic equipment to penetrate, equipment that did not exist in the forward positions. The soldiers had constructed what positions they could with picks and frozen hands. The Soviet attack went through them. December 5th and 6th, 1941, produced the first significant German withdrawals on the Eastern Front. In the northern sector, Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Group began falling back from its forward positions under Soviet pressure. German soldiers and commanders retained their professional discipline under fire and conducted the withdrawal with characteristic tactical competence. But it was withdrawal, not a planned consolidation to a prepared line, but a reaction to Soviet pressure that Army Group Center's depleted forces could not resist. Klin, captured 23 days earlier, was abandoned on December 8th. The equipment left behind included artillery pieces whose tractors had run out of fuel and vehicles broken down on the frozen roads. Soviet cavalry exploiting gaps in the line moved through the German rear areas and struck supply columns and communication nodes. In the south, the Soviet 10th Army struck Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army on December 6th and exposed its right flank east of Tula with a rapidity Guderian had not anticipated. He requested permission to withdraw to a shorter, more defensible line. Hitler refused. The order that went out on December 8th was unambiguous. There would be no withdrawal. Every soldier would hold his position. The order applied military logic to a situation where the physical capacity to execute that logic had been consumed. Soldiers who had been fighting since June, who were frostbitten, who held their weapons in summer uniforms at -30 degrees, were ordered to remain there. Some did. German rearguard units delayed Soviet advances, anti-tank guns destroyed Soviet tanks, infantry held key positions long enough to allow adjacent units to withdraw. But the capacity to obey the Standfast order without tactical adjustment was beyond what the physical condition of the formations permitted. Divisions withdrew, some without authorization, some because their commanding officers determined that remaining in position meant the death or capture of every man and no corresponding operational advantage. Hitler, on December 16th, issued the Haltebefehl, the Standfast order in explicit terms. Army Group Center would hold its current positions. Officers who ordered withdrawal without explicit authorization would be relieved and court-martialed. The first major command change came on December 19th, 1941. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, was dismissed. Hitler assumed personal command of the army himself. The institutional buffer between operational command and the Supreme Commander had been removed. Every operational decision in the East now required Hitler's personal approval. Guderian was relieved of command on December 25, 1941. The immediate cause was a withdrawal Guderian had ordered in his sector without explicit authorization. The withdrawal was operationally rational. A Soviet breakthrough threatened to cut off forward German elements, and a shorter line preserved the cohesion of the 2nd Panzer Army. Guderian ordered it, von Bock reported it to Hitler. Hitler relieved Guderian. In the exchange that followed, Hitler rejected every operational argument with the assertion that the crisis required iron will, not tactical adjustment. Guderian told Hitler that the conditions at the front were beyond what he was describing. Hitler told Guderian that he did not understand the frontline situation. Guderian was one of the most experienced tank commanders in the German army. He had visited the front repeatedly in November and December. The man telling him he did not understand the frontline situation had not been to the Eastern Front. Guderian was dismissed. He would not command again until 1943. General Hoepner, commanding 4th Panzer Group, was dismissed on January 8, 1942, for authorizing a withdrawal in his sector. Hitler stripped him of both command and pension. General Strauss, commanding the 9th Army, was relieved in mid-January. Von Bock was relieved on January 18th, replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. Field Marshal von Leb, commanding Army Group North, was relieved on January 16th. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group South, had been relieved in December. The dismissals removed from active service most of the senior officers who had conducted the campaign and who understood its operational realities from professional experience. Their replacements understood, from the pattern of dismissals around them, that survival in command required compliance with directives rather than accurate negative reporting. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 did not destroy Army Group Center. German forces were pushed back from positions closest to Moscow, Klin, Solnekhnogorsk, Istra, Narofominsk, Kaluga in the south, to a general line running from Zhev in the north through the Vyazma-Yukhanov area to Orel in the south. The line eventually stabilized in January 1942, where the Soviet advance had outrun its own supply situation and exhausted its assault divisions, and where German resistance had slowed the Soviet push to a halt through attrition on both sides. The Wehrmacht in January 1942 was conducting defensive operations along a front of several hundred kilometers, with formations at 20 to 30% of their establishment strength, in temperatures between -25 and -40, without adequate winter clothing, on reduced rations with frozen weapons. They held. That the line held reflects the same professional competence and unit cohesion that had driven the advance forward. But it held at a cost that the Wehrmacht could not sustain indefinitely, and under conditions that German planning had never envisioned. The Standfast order has been debated by military historians in the decades since the war. The evidence supports a partial defense of it in narrow terms. The Wehrmacht's logistical situation was so degraded that a general withdrawal in December 1941 carried genuine risks of operational disintegration. Withdrawing in extreme cold under Soviet pressure with depleted transport was not guaranteed to produce the ordered positions that the theory of strategic withdrawal requires. In this specific and limited sense, Hitler's insistence on holding positions may have prevented a worse outcome than actually occurred. What it did not prevent was the strategic consequence of the entire campaign, the failure to end the war in the East in 1941. The casualty figures for Army Group Center between June 22nd and December 31st, 1941, provide the most objective measure of what the campaign cost. German Army casualties on the entire Eastern Front for 1941 reached approximately 830,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. Army Group Center accounted for the largest share. Military historians estimate that between 100,000 and 133,000 men in Army Group Center were treated for frostbite in November and December 1941 alone. A significant percentage required amputations that rendered them permanently unfit for frontline service. Horse losses through 1941 reached approximately 180,000 animals, a direct reduction in the supply capacity the Army depended on for forward operations. Army Group Center entered the December crisis with approximately 350 operational tanks across all its panzer formations combined, from a June 22nd complement of over 2,000. Artillery, anti-tank gun and vehicle losses from all causes were proportional. The army that began Barbarossa as the most powerful land force ever concentrated in a single operational formation had been reduced to less than 30% of its initial combat power. The Soviet casualty figures for the same period were vastly higher, between 3 and 4 million men killed, wounded or captured in the second half of 1941. The strategic significance of this disparity is that it did not translate into German victory. The Soviet Union absorbed casualties at that scale and continued to fight. The German army could not absorb casualties at the rate it sustained in 1941 without structural degradation. This asymmetry is fundamental to understanding why the campaign failed. The assumption that governed every aspect of Germany's Eastern campaign planning in 1941 was that the Soviet Union would be defeated within 4 to 5 months. This was formally embedded in production schedules, logistical structures, and personnel allocation decisions across the German war economy. Tank production in 1941 was not maximized for the Eastern campaign. Artillery and ammunition production were not maximized. The assumption was that what had been produced and deployed was sufficient for a short campaign. When the campaign extended beyond its projected duration, the reserve capacity that would have supported a longer war did not exist. Soviet production operated under no such assumption. The command economy was fighting for national survival with the full mobilization of its resources. Soviet tank production in 1941 was running at approximately twice the German rate for T-34s and KV-1s by autumn. Soviet artillery production exceeded German production in equivalent calibers. The Soviet production advantage grew every month. The fundamental strategic miscalculation of Barbarossa was not operational. The Wehrmacht's operational performance in 1941 was extraordinary by the standards of military history. The miscalculation was strategic, the assumption that a country of 170 million people, with a developed industrial economy, a large officer corps, and a state apparatus capable of total mobilization, could be defeated in 4 months. The assumption failed. The costs of its failure were paid by the men of Army Group Center in positions they could not defend adequately, in temperatures they could not survive in the clothes they had been given, with weapons that would not fire, on a front that had extended beyond the point where the Army's supply lines could sustain it. December 31st, 1941. Army Group Center's front. The line running from Rzhev in the north through the Vyazma area to Oral in the south was a series of strongpoints, villages, road junctions, rail stations, occupied by German formations and connected by defensive positions that were as solid as exhausted men could make them in frozen ground at minus 30 degrees. The formations holding this line bore the names of the divisions that had crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd. They were not the same formations in any meaningful operational sense. The majority of the men who had crossed the border were dead, wounded, frostbitten to non-deployable status, or hospitalized with illness. The men holding the line were survivors, replacement drafts who had arrived without adequate time for operational integration, and soldiers pulled from rear area duties to fill frontline gaps. Private Wilhelm Prüller, whose diary survived the war and was published post-war, wrote his last entry for the year on December 31st. He wrote that he was alive and that many of his comrades were not. He wrote that the war was not what he had expected when it began. He did not elaborate, he did not need to. The letters from soldiers to their families show a shift in tone between summer and December that requires no analytical framework to interpret. The summer letters are confident, describing a campaign progressing toward a clear end. The December letters are different, measured, controlled, asking for specific items, socks, scarves, the small material needs of men in extreme cold. Several letters ask families to pray. The German army crossed the Soviet border in June 1941 with the collective assumption that the war would be decided before winter. That assumption was held at every level. It was held by the private soldier who did not pack winter gear because his officers told him the war would be over before he needed it. It was held by the divisional quartermaster who prioritized ammunition over felt boots because the combat would be finished first. It was held by the corps commander who reported optimistically because the objective, Moscow, Leningrad, the Caucasus, was within reach. It was held at OKH, which allocated replacements and production on a timetable that assumed victory by October. It was held at Hitler's headquarters, where the map showed German armies deep in Soviet territory, and the intelligence summary said the enemy was finished. The winter of 1941 did not defeat Germany in the east. The war continued for 3.5 more years. Germany would advance again in 1942, driving towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus in an operation of comparable strategic ambition and comparable logistical overextension. The pattern of 1941, rapid advance, supply exhaustion, enemy resistance continuing beyond the point predicted, crisis in the cold, would repeat itself at larger scale in the winter of 1942 to 1943, with consequences more definitively catastrophic. But the winter of 1941 ended something that would not return. It ended the German army's period of operational invulnerability, the months between September 1939 and November 1941, in which every major German offensive had succeeded on its own terms. The French army, which was not incompetent, had collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had evacuated. Yugoslavia, Greece and Crete had fallen in weeks. Poland, Norway, the Low Countries all had demonstrated the Wehrmacht's ability to defeat any European military power in rapid campaigns. The Soviet Union had not fallen. It had been struck by the most powerful military force Germany could assemble at the moment of maximum German advantage and minimum Soviet preparation, and it had refused to collapse. The winter of 1941 made that refusal permanent. An army that had lost 1/3 of its offensive capacity before December, that had consumed its tank reserves, that had deployed no winter planning and delivered no winter clothing, that was sustaining frostbite casualties in numbers comparable to combat losses, that army could not deliver the knockout blow that its operational planning had specified. When December arrived and the blow had not been delivered, the opportunity passed. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 5th did not win the war. It established that the war would be long, and that in a long war, Germany's structural advantages, the professional quality of its officer corps, the tactical excellence of its soldiers, the operational innovation of its armoured doctrine, would erode against Soviet mass, Soviet production, Soviet territorial depth, and Soviet willingness to absorb losses on a scale that no other nation had sustained and continued to fight. General Heinrici wrote in his diary on January 1st, 1942, that the war in the East had shown him something he had not expected to see. He had expected to see an enemy break. He had not seen that. He had seen instead an enemy absorb everything the German army could deliver and return to the fight. That observation, registered by a German corps commander in a private diary at the start of a new year that would bring no improvement, is as precise and economical a statement of the winter of 1941's strategic meaning as exists in the historical record. The German war machine had not broken in the winter of 1941. It had bent severely and held, but the forces that had bent it were still there, had grown, and would apply more pressure the following year. The machine would bend further, and further still. The assumption that had sent men into the Soviet Union in summer uniforms in the belief that winter would not matter was not corrected by the evidence of December 1941. It was superseded. The men in the frozen positions along Army Group Centre's January line understood something that the planners in Berlin had not yet fully absorbed. They were not fighting a campaign. They were fighting a war. The difference, in time, in cost, in the kind of endurance required, was everything. That understanding, arriving in January 1942 across a front of hundreds of kilometres, carried no official designation. It was not recorded in an operational directive or a strategic assessment. It existed in the knowledge of the men who had marched east in the summer and were still standing, colder and fewer and older, in the January dark,